Crosswalks, and we're very like-minded with the Quest in terms of how we think about the world and ministry, and that's born out of crisis, really. So it's a real honor to be here. Steve Lewis, who I think was here just a couple weeks ago, he's a new member at Crosswalk, and we're delighted to have him with us. Hope he did a good job. I'm sure he did, because he's speaking for me twice in July, so I'm really hoping he did a good job. So anyway, great to be with you today, especially on Father's Day. This is an interesting day for me because I have a good relationship with my dad, and I'm aware, however, that that's not always the case. And so I'm going to kind of take you on a journey, my journey a little bit, and just trust me, it's probably going to end out okay. It usually does. We're all going to end at the same time. That's the good news. Whether or not it's good in between there, we'll find out. But that's where I'm going with you today. So if you wouldn't mind, let me lead us in prayer, and then we'll jump right in. What I encourage you to do is just take a deep breath and let it out slowly. And do it again. And I just want you to keep doing that and check in with your body. How are you doing today? Just be aware of any tension you might have. Often shows up in our shoulders and our face muscles. I just encourage you to, as you continue to breathe deeply, become more and more present here. Be aware of all the things on your mind that may be distractions, to-do lists, stuff you want to get to, stuff you want to watch on TV. And just let it go. It'll be there when we're all done. You don't want to miss what the Spirit of God may be whispering into your life today, which may or may not be related to anything I'm going to say or has been said already. So God, we give you the freedom this morning to speak. We choose to open our ears, our minds, our hearts. We say this collectively. I'm not sure, God, how you're going to use me exactly. But I open myself to you that if you nudge me in a particular way, then I ask for your help to follow that. And I pray that something of value you might use today here. And if I have nothing of value to say, God, then I trust that you're going to do something beyond me for those who are gathered here and who are watching. So be with us, to heal us, to restore us, to make us more whole, to make us more well, that we might truly live. In Jesus' name, amen. So I was, I think, 9, 10 years old, and we were getting back from a summer vacation that lasted about 2 weeks. And as I recall, it was a vacation out to see my sister, who at that time lived on the East Coast. We lived in the Kansas City area generally, and made our circuitous path there, saw some sights, made our way back, and by the time we were back to our home, we were exhausted, it was tiring, and we just wanted to get home and relax. And after all the stuff was in from our car, I set out on an immediate course. I'm the youngest in the family, and I needed food, and I needed it right now. And it was like maybe 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. And I had a hunch that the likelihood of finding any food was slim to none. But I decided to take a chance. So I'm in the kitchen, and lo and behold, somehow a banana was there on the counter. There's no way the banana would have lasted 2 weeks on our trip. So somehow it must have been hidden somewhere in our car and never got eaten, most likely by me. It would have been if I would have seen it. And so I grabbed the banana. I was so happy to see the banana. And I sunk my teeth into it. Yeah, everybody got some ice cream and some chocolate? It tasted so good. It was exactly what I needed. And I was in pure delight, savoring every chew and taste and swallow. And then my dad came into the kitchen on the same mission. Looking around, realizing that I had just finished the only edible thing in the entire house. And he looks at me and in a fairly harsh tone, looks me up and down and says, "Do you really think you need that?" And at that moment, honestly, as a 9, 10-year-old boy, I was crushed. I was crushed. I was devastated. I didn't even know what to say. So I just kind of got my tail between my legs, said I was sorry, and made my way to my room and went to bed. When you're that age, I'm sure it's true for girls. I know it's true for boys. We idolize our fathers, right or wrong. There's this picture, a painting in the U.S. Capitol. I didn't know this existed, even though I'd been to the Capitol a couple times in Washington, D.C. I didn't know it existed or even what it was until I was reading the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, and he talks about this thing. And in the rotunda, in the dome, is a painting called The Apotheosis of Washington. You familiar with that? Apotheosis is one of those words that you can use to impress your friends. It means when we take a human being and we transform them into a god. And so this painting is of George Washington surrounded by angels. And of course, it's at the top of the dome, which means that he is ascending to the heavens, the apotheosis of George Washington. He is our Caesar in our country, right? Who at his death certainly went up to be among the gods. And I think we do that a lot with our dads, especially when we're young. They are gods in our lives. And at that moment, at 9, 10 years old, God had spoken. And the way I received what God had spoken was harsh, critical, maybe even a jab at my husky appearance. And it hurt. And I didn't know what to do with it, except just to take it. Because what else do you do when God speaks to you? But just take it. Well, the flip side of apotheosis, if apotheosis is at the top, then debasement, not the basement, but it kind of sounds like that, debasement has to be the other side, where we completely strip all of these godlike qualities from people. And I think for some of us who've grown up in households that weren't as healthy as mine, because mine really was a fairly healthy household, some of us, we go to that place very easily, and we can only think of these awful things of people who've hurt us or wronged us in our lives. And actually, this combination of apotheosis and debasement actually has a very deep theological grounding. In the very first book of the Bible, Genesis is a story of beginnings. And it was written about 800 BC or so to speak into the Jewish people's lives, to help them understand who they are as a people, the beginnings of this nation. And right in the second chapter, it's a little bit odd because you start with Genesis 1 where God creates everything in these 7 days and all this kind of stuff. And then you get a more primitive creation story in chapter 2. But there's this beautiful thread that runs through it right at the beginning. And it says that God formed Adam. Eve isn't around yet. She's going to come in a little bit. But forms this Adam out of dust. And Adam is just a dirt clod, really, until God breathes life into his nostrils. And that's how the Jewish community began to understand humanity itself. Is not just dirt clods, but divinely infused dirt clods. We are divine and dust, apotheosis and debasement. We're both. So after Bananagate, that's what that incident is known the world over, about 10 years after, I started to really come to grips with what Bananagate really represented, which was more than just a banana incident. It was really coming to grips with my own father's dustiness, if you will, where the God-likeness was starting, that veneer was starting to fade some, and I was realizing more and more who my dad was. And just to set the record straight, I love my dad, and my dad and I have a good relationship. And I had it good, but what I do want to tell you is that all of our stuff is all relative to our lives. So I have friends that have much worse stories, and yet their struggle is not that dissimilar from me at its core in terms of the issues that we deal with. So there I was, now 19 years old, coming to grips with the full dust quotient of my father. And debasement was at the forefront of my mind as I realized it was more than just a banana. But as I took another bite and tasted it again, I was just reminded. I was reminded of pain. That pain ticked off, that represented other pain in my life. Pain not intentionally inflicted by my father, but there anyway, because my dad is not a god. My dad is a divine-filled dirt clod, just like me. And I started to see that dustiness and came to realize other ways I'd experienced the dustiness of my father just because he's a human being. And it was extremely painful, excruciating. That was when I began to understand what weeping was. I remember weeping when my cat died when I was 10 years old. But I hadn't wept like this. Just sobbing. Coming to grips with what was and is. It was an innocence loss kind of growth. You know what I'm talking about? It's sort of a rite of passage I think every adult has to go through, and I was going through it. And it was deeply painful. Last week I came across this quote from Richard Rohr. I'm a big fan of Richard Rohr. And he says this about our painful stuff. He says, as any good therapist will tell you, you cannot heal what you do not acknowledge. What you do not consciously acknowledge will remain in control from within, festering and destroying you and those around you. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus teaches, if you bring forth that which is within you, it will save you. If you do not bring it forth, it will destroy you. Those are great words. And you know, the greatness of those words go both ways. If we don't come to grips with the dustiness of the people around us and how that dustiness has dusted us, if we don't deal with that stuff, be sure it will deal with you. One way or another, our pain will deal with us. And you know, the interesting thing is I think the same is true of divinity. When we don't fully appreciate the divinity in other people, that also has its way with us. Because there is this part of us, as fellow dusty, divine-filled dirt clods, there is a part of us that is of God, that the breath of God is within us and is beckoning forth an appreciation of divinity right before our eyes. And that cannot be silenced either. This stuff has to be dealt with. Right or wrong, good and bad. This tension between dust and divinity. There's this great story in Genesis, and it's a story about two boys growing up to be men who had serious daddy issues. These kids' names were Jacob and Esau. Maybe you've read the story. It's a great read. It's an amazing story. Genesis as a whole it's complicated. You need some help with it, but it's an amazing book and a pretty easy read for the most part. Well, Jacob and Esau had daddy issues, largely because Isaac had daddy issues. Try getting over this one. Your father Abraham senses that God wants him to sacrifice you on top of a mountain over a fire and has you carry the wood on the hike. and ties you up, and at the last second before he's about to make this thing happen, here's a voice out of nowhere saying, okay, stop right now. There were no therapists in the village that day, and so Isaac is carrying this around. I have a hunch he married a very strong woman because he needed a very strong woman to carry the freight of his whole life. Because that's just my little conjecture there, but I think Isaac was a mess. And by the time he had these twins, Jacob and Esau, he was still a mess. Very, very dusty. Not sure where the divinity in there was, because he was, if I can say it, a lousy, lousy father. He made it absolutely clear that Esau was his favorite kid. Absolutely clear. And everybody knew it. So as the two boys started to grow up, and as Isaac began to grow weak with his old age, knowing that he was going to die, he was ready to sign his trust, ready to lay hands on Esau and grant him authority over all of the property in the estate and the future business. They were loaded, by the way. And Rebekah, Isaac's wife, knows what's going down and knows her boys. Esau was an avid outdoorsman. Loved to be out there, could hunt and kill anything, probably awesome at all that stuff. Jacob was a CPA. Jacob knew how to run a business. Esau maybe did not. And Rebekah knew it. And so Rebekah knows what's about to go down and talks to Jacob and says, hey, we're gonna have to pull a coup here. This is going to be uncomfortable, but get over it. This is important for the family. And so anyway, they trick Isaac. It's a great story. And Isaac grants the deed to the whole company, gives the power. He becomes president and CEO. Jacob does, just like that. 5 minutes later, Esau comes in ready to take the mantle. Finds out it's already been given and there's nothing he can do. Esau is a hunter. Jacob knows that. Esau's grabbing his bow and his knife and whatever he's got. And as you can imagine, Jacob ran for his life. And he kept on running. He ran to a relative's place. His name was Laban, who was just about as much as a honest fellow as Jacob was. And there he spent the next 2 decades thinking things through. Meanwhile, the family business was left behind. 2 decades to work things over in his mind. What had happened, who he was, who his dad was, who his brother was, who he wanted to be. He got swindled himself. Laban was a kind of a distant cousin, and he had daughters, and Jacob ends up marrying one of the daughters, kind of a trickery, so he kind of married his cousin. I think that's where Arkansas got the idea. I'm not entirely sure, but anyway. Marries this cousin, wakes up the day after his wedding, and looks over at his wife and finds out he married the wrong sister. I mean, this is really in the Bible. It's an amazing story. And he's like, holy cow, what are you doing here? It's like, oh, don't ask me, ask my dad. So he goes and asks, what is she doing there? And found out, well, he'd been tricked. And so he cuts another deal. He'd already worked 7 years to get this wife, the wrong wife. And so he made a deal to work another 7 to get the sister that he thought he was marrying in the first place. And so he cuts a deal, gets married to the other wife, and so now he's got 2 wives, and they start, well, one of them has kids, and there's sort of this tension there with all that, and years go by, and we're up to 2 decades. And finally, Jacob's had enough. He's had enough of the pain. He's had enough of the angst. He's ready to go back home. He's ready to go back home and face what could be horrible, deathly pain. And you got to wonder why. Why did he choose to do that? Well, I think it has something to do with the fact that his pain in the present, where he was greater in his mind than his imagined pain if he goes back and tries to patch things up with his brother who, last he remembers, wanted to kill him. Can you imagine that kind of a place? Option A, terrible pain. Option B, terrible pain that might lead to death. But that's kind of how it works, isn't it? usually we don't change that quickly. Usually we aren't proactive in our growth. Almost all the time, and I bet we could tell stories here today about how it had to get so bad for you before you were willing to take the step toward healing. Before you had to make the decision to quit that job or to have that conversation with your spouse or to finally, stand up for yourself in whatever venue. The pain has to be bad enough. That's human nature. And we generally don't change unless we have to, unless it's just too much. And that's where it was for Jacob. So he makes his way back, and you can imagine the kinds of things he's imagining he's going to face when he finds his brother Esau. And they finally get to the edge of their area. And he does everything he can to butter up Esau in advance. He kind of marches all of his belongings in a train. That's sort of what you would do, as if to say, Esau, if you want all of my belongings, they're yours if you want. And so all of his sheep and goats, and then his family and his servants, he was loaded by now. All this grand parade going up to Esau. And Esau is seeing this. Certainly he knew they were coming. This is not like, a party of four and a cord, coming across the country. This is a large group of people that are making their way. And he knew that they were coming. And the night before he knows he's going to meet Esau, if you've read it, he has this wrestling match. Genesis says it was with an angel of God. And this wrestling match is really about who are you going to be, Jacob? Is what is ahead of you really worth it? Are you willing to fight through the night to become what you want to become? Or is this that important to you that you're willing to go the distance with this? Because you could run. You could go right back to where you were and start all over. But Jacob fought through the night. And the next morning, this angel does something to his hip which messes with him. And then gives him a new name and a blessing. He says, your name is Israel, which means struggles with God. And you can imagine everybody in 800 BC who are reading this, who've heard these stories over the century, and they're hearing their name as a people. Israel means struggles with God. And they're like, yes. Oh, how do we know that? Sometimes struggling against God, struggling with God as it's in a wrestling match, and sometimes struggling with God as as God joins in their struggle toward whatever they're trying to do. It's both and. And the people resonate with that. And they know what's coming. And what's coming is this. Jacob decides to move forward. Decides to meet his brother Esau. Comes like this. And says, everything you've seen in the parade, my brother, is yours if you want it. It's been 2 decades for Esau too. He's had time to sort things out. Wondering where things are and where they need to go next. And Esau does not pull out his sword, does not pull out his bow and arrows, but instead embraces his brother, welcomes him. Doesn't always turn out that way, but it did this time, and it was worth the risk. Well, I had another run-in with Bananagate. This time was after another 10 years. Am I making anybody hungry out there? Mm-hmm. You're welcome. So this time, it's 10 years later, and I've got a kid. I've got 2. I've got my son Noah, who's at that time was, maybe 2, something like that, maybe 3, and my daughter, who's 2 years younger. And if any of you have raised young kids, you know that time in your life is hell, really. It's that's what it is. There's a reason we look as tired as we do. It's because we are that tired, because it's just that tough. And it's wonderful at the same time. I love my children. I love them. But that time in life, my wife loves our children. But that time in life, they need you all the time. There is no time for you. You get home from work, you're there, and you are theirs. I would come home, from work, and Lynn would literally hand the kid off to me so she could have 5 minutes, to herself. Finally, there were some days where I'd come home and, she hadn't showered because she couldn't, because there was no way she could get to something, so unimportant as personal bathing. You know what I mean? That's kind of it for young parents. And I remember one particular day, I had an insight because of the experience I'd just gone through. And it was a long day. I don't remember the circumstances, but probably because Noah's the older, he probably bore the brunt of it. And he probably came up to me very innocently, probably even ate the last edible thing in the house, and I was hungry. And I probably looked at him, and I probably snapped at him for all I remember, but I remember snapping at my son, who I love. And I had this immediate flashback to Bananagate. I was like, I'm turning into my father. That's not the first thing I thought. But what I really thought of is I had a whole new vision on that experience. See, when I was 9 years old, I thought God had spoken to me. And God had said, you don't need that, and I need to feel shame about that. And a little bit later, in full awareness of the dustiness of my dad, and he's a wonderful man, but dusty just the same, even as that was happening, I recognized that I had a lot of pain to deal with and to work through. Well, thank you. I can honestly say nobody's ever done that for me at my church. Lo and behold, it's almost a miracle. Thank you. And now I had this new insight, though, which actually completely changed my vision of Bananagate, where Dad was no longer godlike, no longer debased and just this dusty dirt clod. But now I recognize what was really going on that night when I was 9 years old. My dad was hangry. You know what that word is? You're hungry, and that makes you angry, and you're not yourself, and you snap. I'm certain my father does not remember Bananagate at all. I'm certain of it. My dad is an incredibly kind man. He would not do that. Even when I really deserved it, he would not raise his voice with me. And so I had this new insight, like, oh, I was just hangry with my son. I guess I've got my own work to do here as a grown-up, trying to figure out how to work out my own tension and dust and divinity, my own forgiveness issues with myself. And this reminded me of this quote that I came across from Rohr again, that had to do with, certainly with Jacob and Esau, but also worked well with my experience, where he says, only mutual apology, healing, and forgiveness offer a sustainable future for humanity. Otherwise, we are controlled by the past, individually and corporately. We all need to apologize, and we all need to forgive, or this human project will surely self-destruct. No wonder that almost 2/3 of Jesus' teaching is directly or indirectly about forgiveness. Otherwise, history devolves into taking sides, bitterness, holding grudges, and the violence that inevitably follows. As others have said, this is brilliant. Forgiveness is to let go of our hope for a different past. Hear that. Forgiveness is to let go of our hope for a different past. Reality is what it is, and as such, acceptance leads to great freedom, as long as there is also both accountability and healing forgiveness. Rich stuff. Our stories are what they are. There's no need to push them under the rug. They are what they are. But it's only when we allow everything to belong that we can overcome what's there. Reminds me of a story of Jesus. In John chapter 5, Jesus is back in Jerusalem for a festival. And while he's there, he goes up to the pool of Bethsaida. And there's a lame man there, a man who can't walk, I guess. Jesus sees him and hears his story. And there's this legend that at times the pool of Bethsaida, the water would be stirred, presumably by the Holy Spirit. And apparently the first one or two or few who got to the pool in time would experience miraculous healing of whatever ailed them. And so Jesus goes up and says, hey, how long have you been here? And the man says, I've been here for 38 years. 38 years. Hasn't been able to get to the pool in time. And Jesus is thinking about that. 38 years? And all that time, you couldn't have formed a committee of people that at the moment they started to see it would rush you, throw you in the pool that you might be healed. 38 years? And so then Jesus asks a very insightful question. Looks them in the eye and says, do you want to be well? That is not a stupid question, is it? Because honestly, I turn 48 tomorrow. If any of you are looking for gift ideas, thank you very much. If any of you have a spare Tesla around, I'm open to that. Whatever you want. It is not hard for me to imagine that somebody is sitting 38 years in their pain and is not yet well. Because we don't like to change. We prefer the discomfort that we know to the discomfort that we don't know. And we would prefer to stay even in abusive environments because we are so afraid of what change might bring. It is not an accident. It is not a stupid question to ask a man sitting by a miraculous pool, do you want to be well? Because that is the human condition, and it is the question for you and me today and every day. What keeps you down? What keeps you from being fully, totally well? And are you willing? Are you willing to hear the voice of God speak to you? Come home, as he did to Jacob. Come home, trust me. Are you able to hear the voice that is a whisper in your ears, breathy, with the same breath that is flowing, coursing through your veins, because you are dust and divinity both? Are you willing to hear the voice of the Spirit speak as Jesus? Do you want to be well? Because it is an invitation, and it is an ongoing invitation. And it is here for you today, and it will be here tomorrow and the next day, all with the same purpose, that you would be made more whole. That those broken places would be mended, that those places that seem like you're lame, to use an old term, are all of a sudden strengthened up, and you're able to move in ways you haven't before. It's beautiful what Jesus is offering. By the way, the guy gets healed. He says yes. And then a whole new world opens up to him, which at once had to be terrifying, because now he can walk. Now his world is completely different. Now what do I do? That's a question he hasn't had to think about for 38 years. And yet he wanted to be well. Well, last week I took a quick road trip down to Fresno, because who doesn't want to go down to Fresno in the summer? And on the way there and back, my son, he got me this Audible book. It's by a guy named Mark Manson. It's a New York Times bestseller for the past couple of years. It's entitled The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fick, I think is the word. There's an asterisk between the F and the CK, and I'm pretty sure it's fick. I don't know any other word that it could be, so let's go with fick. The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fick is what that thing is, and it all has to do with an orientation toward life. It's actually a really good book. It's not going to make a good Hallmark movie. It's never going to be a Christian-produced movie, but it's a pretty good book. It talks about what are we really caring about? What are we really about? And as I was listening to this book, on the way down and back from Fresno, you guessed it, Bananagate come back to haunt me.
Yes, we have no bananas.
And so I realized that as I was hearing some of the things this author was saying, it was triggering things in me about who I am, who I want to be. Where am I centering myself? Where is my strength coming from? Where's my esteem coming from? Why do I think the way I do about who I am? And yes, there were daddy issues still with that, even though I thought I was done with daddy issues. And then it dawned on me. I'm still dusty, and the divine is still calling in me. And the reality is, with these significant milestone-type moments in our lives, whatever they are, often they represent a painful period in our lives. These things just don't go away, but they stay with us on purpose. They become our friends, even though we don't always welcome them at first. These touch points that we thought we were all done with, they do stay with us. And it's like we're going up a mountain, and the first time around it's just awful, and we think it's terrible. And we think we're done with it, and we get around the mountain, we're a little bit higher than we were before, and the same central issue comes up. For me, this daddy issue comes back up. But now I see things a little bit different because it's 10 years later. And I kind of resolve some of that. And then I go up, and it's 10 years after that, and I come back to a new face of daddy issues and deal with it there. Like, oh, I'm done. And then I come back to just right now. And I will again and again. Because these moments in our lives are touch points for the Spirit of God to whisper one more time, do you want to be well? This is a pivotal core issue for you. Do you want to be well? And that's what I leave you with today. I know change is hard. You guys are going through change as a church, and I pray for you as a church. Individually, you all are dusty, divine creatures, which means that there is stuff to get healed. There are wounds to be mended. There is brokenness to be made whole. How are you hearing the whisper of God in you today? Do you want to be well? And do you? Let's pray together. God, I thank you for Bananagate. There were a lot of times in my life I didn't, but I do now. There are a lot of times, and in fact, every time Bananagate comes around, God, I don't really welcome it. I'm kind of tired of banana. But then, because of your patience and your gentleness, and your words to me, do you want to be well? I recognize that there is a deeper wellness to be had. There is a deeper wholeness to experience. There is more life to be lived that somehow I have been limited and did not even know it until Bananagate come back around. And I'm wondering, God, what Bananagate is for people here today. What they've experienced, things they thought they put to bed, which really haven't been, because they're pivotal, they're core to who they are and who they're becoming. So I pray that your Spirit would give us sensitivity to how you're shaping us and how you're moving in us. And I pray that you would give us ears to hear, a mind that is truly open, hearts that are soft, to be able to hear love in your invitation. Do you want to be well? And not sarcasm or judgment, but a true, genuine, do you want to get better than this? Do you want to get more whole than this? And I pray that our answer will be yes. Because you long for us, dirt clods, to experience more divinity. May we become more well, more whole. And may we extend the invitation to any and all we come across who are stuck on their own Bananagate. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.
So for the last couple of weeks, we've been singing this song as a closing song and a blessing. It comes from the Old Testament book of Numbers, and God gives this blessing to the priests to bless the people. And it says, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. and be gracious to you. In the second part of it, it says, may the Lord lift his countenance upon you. And I had a friend earlier this week say, what's a countenance? And it's just an old-fashioned word for smile or a facial expression. So this song really just says, may God smile on you. And I'd like to invite you to stand up. And it's a kind of a call and response song. I'll sing and you echo back to me. May the Lord bless you and keep you.
May the Lord bless you and keep you.
May the Lord make his face to shine on you.
May the Lord make his face to shine on you.
And be gracious to you.
And be gracious to you.
May the Lord lift his countenance on 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 you.
May he keep you in perfect peace.
May he keep you in perfect peace.
Sing it just one more time. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord bless you and keep you.
May the Lord bless you and keep you.
May the Lord make his face to shine on you.
May the Lord make his face to shine on you.
And be gracious to you.
And be gracious to you.
May the Lord lift his countenance on 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 you.
May he keep you in perfect peace.
May he keep you in perfect peace.
Dirt clods, as you leave this place, may you be sensitive to the whims of the Spirit, who are calling you as dirt clods, beautiful, wonderfully crafted, uniquely crafted pieces of earth and creation. May you realize that the Spirit of God is coursing through your veins, calling you to become what you are capable of becoming, more and more whole and beautiful, reflecting the countenance of God. Go in peace.